You're listening to Bark and Wag's 15-Minute Vet Talk. Each week, your host, Polly Requa, interviews veterinarians and individuals in the pet industry from across the nation answering pet questions. Bark and Wag podcast is produced weekly for your enjoyment, and show notes can be found at barkandwag.com under the podcast tab. That's BARKNWAG.com. Please remember to subscribe to Bark and Wag 15-Minute Vet Talk.
Thank you for listening to Bark and Wag 15-Minute Vet Talk. Bark and Wag is dedicated to protecting our dogs through advocacy, education, and supporting like-minded dog lovers by selling custom pet products. Bark and Wag is excited to announce our new partnership with a Colorado hemp farm to produce a line of CBD products for your pets. Bark and Wag has CBD pet tincture available in 300, 750, 1200, and 2400 milligrams. Bark and Wag CBD is pet safe, no THC, it's made in the USA, and is CO2 extracted. Please check out Bark and Wag's website, barkandwag.com. That is BARK, the letter N, WAG.com, to see our line of CBD and awesome merchandise. We love pooch ideas for podcasts and merchandise, so anytime send an email to Polly at barkandwag.com with your suggestions.
Welcome to Bark and Wag 15-Minute Vet Talk. I'm your host, Polly Requa. Today we're talking to Francesca Arnoldy, author and end-of-life doula. Welcome, Francesca. Thank you for being on the show. I wanted to have you back to see if you could discuss with the listeners the stages of grieving and how to help the listeners after their pet has passed.
Sure. Thanks for having me back. We definitely honor the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and what she was doing at that time was quite groundbreaking because the culture wasn't really open to learning directly from people who were dying. And that's exactly what she decided to do, was be at the bedside and learn from people who were facing death. So the stages of grief, which is a condensed version that we know really well in our society, that's really based off of anticipatory grief. So that's when there is an impending loss. People will often go through, shift in and out of, possibly skip some of them, spend more time in others through these 5, which include denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And it's definitely not an incremental step-by-step, and then you sort of reach the end goal. It's messy and it's unique for every person who's facing loss. So what we know with pet grief is that often a person who has a companion animal who is ill, seriously ill, potentially terminally ill, is going to be shifting in and out of some of these stages as they're making the difficult decisions on behalf of their pet and getting closer to that time of saying their final goodbye. Then after the death is another opportunity to be able to provide support. So as a doula, what I like to focus on is story listening and legacy work. So as a story listener, I invite people to recount their experience. And even if I had been a presence along with them throughout, it's really important to remove myself and allow them the spotlight and space to do so. So I really kind of frame the conversation, make sure we're in a comfortable place, make sure it's a good day for that mourner, because if the grief feels too raw or too overwhelming, it's probably not the right time to bring it all up again. But I leave it up to them and I kind of check in, make sure it still feels like a good time to have this visit. And then I open it up really broadly and say, I would love to hear the story from your perspective in your own words, in as much detail as you would like to share the journey of you and your beloved pet through the end of life up till now. And so that person will, I lean on silence a lot as a listener, and that person will kind of usually pause, take a breath, and choose a starting point. And then it's not always chronological, but I'm able to witness as they are picking and choosing different moments to reflect on, different memories, and they kind of let themselves go down different avenues and explore. They might bring up stuff from their past as well that feels important. They're asking questions, they're wondering aloud, and they're really kind of putting these pieces together, which we trust is helping them to integrate this new reality and this huge shift that they've endured. As a listener, I really aim to suspend any judgment. I'm not there to answer their questions or to make sense of their experience. I'm there as a person who is compassionate and attentive and present as they're doing that work. And then with legacy work, it's really thinking about memories and how do you want to honor this relationship? Is it through creating some sort of altar with photographs and mementos? Maybe is it a donation in the name of your pet? Is it digging up and creating a garden in honor of your pet, somewhere where you can physically go visit and feel closer to the memories of your companion animal? So a variety of ways that those projects continue to assist with the processing and the healing that is a long journey after loss.
So what are the stages of grieving?
So they are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. That's the condensed version. That's actually longer than that if you read her work.
Okay, interesting. And what other suggestions do you have for pet owners that are, devastated over the loss of their pets?
As a doula, I like to normalize grief because sometimes people feel very alone in that process. And we don't talk about it a lot, especially pet loss in our society. So saying things like, being the decision maker on behalf of your companion animal is really heavy, and pausing, allowing for silence, which is inviting them to maybe share about that, because we know statistically a lot of people are carrying that. At best, they're questioning themselves and maybe doubting themselves. And then maybe they're carrying really heavy regret. They wish they had done things differently. And we can normalize that and say that's a really common response to pet loss, and it's very heavy. So that makes them feel a little less alone in that feeling. And then thinking about really celebrating the bond that they did share and reminding them that, if you knew all the information that you do now, of course you would look back and potentially make different decisions, but you were working with the information you had and you were trying to make the best decisions you could based on your pet and you and the really complicated circumstance that you were involved in. And so trying to help them work through some of that guilt that's really kind of overloaded on top of their grief.
Sure. Yeah, it's so hard to lose a pet. Are there any other tips that you would give a pet owner after the loss?
I think giving yourself permission to grieve and to mourn, not feel like you have to completely stifle it and move on, not feel like you have to go at anybody else's pace. Some people will say, well, it's been a week or it's been a month or it's been a year, or you over it. You have your own timeline and it's your own journey. And so doing what you need to do to take good care of yourself. And that goes for taking into consideration, are you going to welcome a new pet into your life or not? And not feeling like you have to take advice from people who maybe aren't really focusing that advice on your perspective and your wishes and your beliefs and honoring where you actually are at. Generally, people mean well, but when they say things like, at least, or they tell you exactly what they did in that situation, or they try to make sense of what happened for you, it's generally not going to facilitate your grief in a healthy way.
Sure. Well, thank you for being on the podcast, and we look forward to having you back.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Bark and Wag's 15-Minute Vet Talk. If you like what you just heard, we hope you'll pass along our web address, www.barkandwag.com, to your friends and other pet owners. Have a pressing question for a veterinarian? Ask your question at barkandwag.com under the podcast tab. This has been a KFR production. Join us next time for another edition of Bark and Wag's 15-Minute Vet Talk.